I'm 73 years old. I've lived alone on this stretch of coastline for longer than most people stay married. And for 30 years, more than half my adult life, I kept something hidden in the remains of the old Whitmore dock that would have changed everything we think we know about the world. I won't ask you to believe it. I didn't believe it myself that first night when I found her tangled in the pylons with a gash across her ribs that exposed muscle the color of pearl. I stood there in water up to my chest, my headlamp catching the impossible geometry of her face, and I understood that my life had just divided into before and after. Her name, if she had one, if that concept even applies, I never learned. I called her Marina, which felt both appropriate and absurd. She lived in a space I built beneath the dock's collapsed northern section in a tidal pool I engineered to maintain salt balance and temperature. I fed her, I cleaned her wounds, I watched her heal and adapt and, in ways I still don't fully understand, communicate. No one knew, not my sister in Portland, not the few acquaintances I kept at the harbor bar, not the teenagers who sometimes broke into the dock's upper level to drink and smoke. For 3 decades, I carried a secret so vast it separated me from every human conversation, every casual interaction. You learn to live with that weight. You learn to prefer it. Last month, someone found out. The city had been talking about demolishing Whitmore for years. Liability concerns, waterfront development, the usual. But talk became action. A surveying crew arrived with drones and laser equipment, and in the age of thermal imaging and high-resolution aerial photography, there are no hidden places left. Not really. I'm telling this now because the choice has been taken from me, because what happens next is out of my hands, and because I need someone to understand that what I did, the decades of secrecy, the isolation, the lies, wasn't madness or cruelty. It was the only way I knew to protect something that shouldn't exist from a world that would have destroyed it in the name of understanding it. My name is Robert Tessier. I worked the commercial fishing boats out of Point Harmon from age 16 to 42 when my back gave out and the industry was already dying anyway. After that, I picked up work where I could find it. Dock maintenance, some light construction, eventually a night security contract for the municipal marina. I wasn't anyone special. I knew how to fix an outboard motor and tie a bowline in the dark. I knew the tides and the winter storm patterns and which channels the herring ran through in September. I lived in a 1-bedroom rental above the old chandlery, 7 blocks from the waterfront. It was the kind of place where everyone knew your routine, but nobody knew your life. Coastal towns are good for that. You can be alone without seeming strange. The Whitmore dock had been abandoned since 1987, when the freight company that owned it went bankrupt. It sat on the eastern edge of the commercial zone, a skeletal structure of creosote-soaked pilings and rusted girders extending 200 feet into the harbor. The main platform had partially collapsed in the early 90s. After that, the city put up chain link and warning signs, then mostly forgot about it. I'd been walking the waterfront at night for years by then. Insomnia was an old companion. I'd leave my apartment around 11 and walk the length of the harbor and back, sometimes twice. The route took me past Whitmore every time. It was a place that existed between states, not quite in the water, not quite on land, not fully destroyed but no longer functional. The kind of location that stops registering in people's minds. They see it without seeing it. The way you stop noticing a scar on your own hand. That's what made it perfect, though I didn't know that yet. The structure had a specific smell, salt and rot, and the sharp petroleum tang of old wood preservative breaking down. When the tide was out, you could see the lower pylons slick with kelp and barnacles. When it was in, the water moved through the collapsed sections with a rhythmic slap that sounded almost deliberate, almost like language. I knew the dock's architecture the way you know your own house in the dark. The northern section had dropped about 6 feet when the support beams failed, creating a kind of angled shelter partially submerged at high tide. There was an access ladder on the south side, rusted but climbable. The chain link had gaps where bolt cutters had done their work over the years. Urban explorers came through sometimes, bored teenagers. Once, a photographer working on a book about industrial decay. They'd climb around, take their pictures, leave their beer cans. But they came during the day, and they stayed on the upper levels. No one went into the water. No one had a reason to. I'd never thought of the place as anything other than a ruin, a landmark in my nightly walks, something sad and slowly dying that the city would eventually get around to erasing. That changed on November 4th, 2012. There had been a storm the previous 2 days, not a hurricane, but a sustained nor'easter that kicked up 8-foot swells and pushed debris into every corner of the harbor. By the 4th, it had blown itself out, but the water was still agitated, still carrying the memory of violence. I was walking my usual route. It was past midnight. The commercial district was empty except for the security lights on the warehouse buildings and the distant sound of halyards clanging against masts in the marina. The air had that scrubbed clean quality it gets after a storm, cold and sharp. I almost didn't stop. I'd passed Whitmore hundreds of times, but that night I heard something. Not a voice, not anything I could identify immediately, just a sound that didn't fit, a low, rhythmic disturbance in the water beneath the collapsed northern platform. The pattern was wrong, too regular to be debris, too sustained to be a trapped seal or a large fish. I stood at the chain link for maybe 30 seconds, listening. Then I found the gap I knew was there and went through. The ladder was slippery with spray. I climbed down to the lower platform, which was canted at about 15 degrees and slick with kelp. The tide was coming in. Water was already covering the northern third of the broken decking. I had a headlamp in my jacket pocket. I always carried one on my walks. I switched it on and directed it toward the sound. That's when I saw the net. It was a trawler's ghost net, the kind that breaks loose and drifts for years, collecting debris and killing everything that blunders into it. This one had wrapped itself around 3 of the northern pylons, creating a dense tangle that rose and fell with the swell. And there was something caught in it. My first thought was, dolphin. We got them in the harbor sometimes, especially after storms. But as I moved closer, angling the light, the shape resolved into something that made my brain stutter and reset. It was humanoid, approximately 5.5 feet long. The upper body, torso, shoulders, arms, read as female, though the proportions were subtly wrong in ways I couldn't immediately articulate. The lower body transitioned into something streamlined and powerful, covered in scales that reflected my light in iridescent bands of gray and silver green. The tail, because that's what it was, there's no other word, was partially torn. That's what had caused the sound. The creature was still alive, still struggling weakly against the net, and each movement pulled the tier wider. I don't remember climbing down into the water. I don't remember making a decision. I just remember the shock of cold and the smell of blood in the brine, and the way my hands moved automatically to start cutting through the net with the folding knife I carried. The creature turned its head toward me. Its eyes were larger than human eyes. The color was difficult to pin down, somewhere between amber and gray, with a reflective quality like a cat's tapetum lucidum. There was no white visible, just iris and a slit pupil that contracted in my headlamp beam. We looked at each other, and I understood, with a certainty I still can't explain, that there was intelligence there, not human intelligence, but awareness, recognition, a plea I didn't need language to interpret. I kept cutting. The water was 48 degrees, cold enough that I had maybe 20 minutes before hypothermia started making decisions for me. I worked fast, sawing through the synthetic mesh with my knife while trying not to cut her. The net had wrapped around her midsection and tail in layers, each loop cinching tighter with her struggles. She'd stopped moving by the time I got through the first section. I thought she might be dead. Then I saw the barely perceptible rise and fall of her ribs, the slight flutter of the gills. I could see them now, 3 vertical slits on each side of her neck, mostly closed but pulsing weakly. The wound on her left side was worse up close. The net had abraded through scales and skin, exposing muscle in a crescent about 7 inches long. In the beam of my headlamp, I could see the tissue was a pale, translucent pink, nothing like mammalian flesh. It didn't bleed the way a human wound would. Instead, there was a slow seepage of fluid that was thicker than blood, with an opalescent quality. I got the last of the net cut away, and she dropped deeper into the water, sinking toward the bottom of the tidal pool that had formed in the collapsed structure. I went under after her, my hands finding purchase on what I thought was her shoulder. Her skin wasn't scaled there. It was smooth, almost frictionless, and colder than the surrounding water. I pulled her upward and broke the surface. Gasping, there was a section of the old platform that formed a kind of shelf just above the waterline. I managed to get her partially onto it, enough that her head and upper body were clear of the water. That's when I got my first clear look at her face. The structure was humanoid, but not human. The proportions were elongated. The distance from chin to crown was longer than it should have been, giving her features a stretched, almost equine quality. Her nose was smaller than a human nose, little more than 2 slits. Her mouth was wider, the lips thin but well-defined. Her skin had a faint pattern to it, an almost imperceptible stippling that might have been vestigial scales or something else entirely. Her hair, I'm still not sure if that's the right word, was plastered to her skull and shoulders. It was dark, somewhere between brown and deep green, and the texture was wrong. Not quite hair, not quite kelp. Something in between. She made a sound then, low and resonant, vibrating. In a register I felt in my sternum more than heard. It wasn't language, but it wasn't meaningless either. I realized I was holding my breath. I forced myself to breathe, to think, to assess the situation with something resembling rationality. She was injured, she was clearly in distress, and she was impossible. Every rational option ran through my head in sequence. Call 911, contact the university's marine biology department, call the Coast Guard. Each option led to the same outcome. This creature, this being, would become a specimen. She would be taken somewhere with fluorescent lights and metal tables. She would be studied, photographed, dissected if she died, confined if she lived. I thought about the Montauk monster, the rotting carcass that washed up on a New York beach in 2008 and became a media circus. I thought about every nature documentary I'd ever seen where they tranquilized an animal and tagged it and called it conservation. I thought about the elephant seals I'd watched being studied at Point Reyes, massive wild creatures reduced to data points and tracking numbers. The water was getting higher. The tide was still coming in. In another 40 minutes, the shelf where I'd laid her would be submerged. I looked at the structure around me. The collapsed northern platform had created a semi-enclosed space, partially roofed by the broken decking above, walled on 2 sides by pylons, open to the harbor on the north, but protected by the angle of the collapse. The tidal pool was maybe 12 feet across and 8 feet deep at high tide, connected to the open water by gaps between the pylons that were large enough for water flow but could be modified. I could build something here. I could make this space work. The thought arrived fully formed, and I recognized it immediately as insane, but I also recognized it as the only thought I was going to act on. I worked through that night and into the dawn, moving on autopilot and adrenaline. First, I needed to stabilize her. I had a first aid kit in my apartment, antibiotics left over from a tooth infection, clean cloth for bandages. I climbed out of the water, stripped off my soaked jacket, and ran the 7 blocks home. My apartment had become a staging area by the time the sun came up. I'd gathered every supply I could think of: the first aid kit, a camping tarp, marine epoxy, zip ties, my toolbox, every towel I owned. I filled a cooler with ice and the frozen mackerel I kept for bait. When I returned to the dock, she was exactly where I'd left her, still partially on the shelf, still breathing. I climbed back into the water and started working. I cleaned the wound as best I could with bottled water and gauze. I had no idea if human antibiotics would work on her physiology, but I crushed 2 pills and mixed them with petroleum jelly, creating a paste I spread over the exposed tissue before covering it with a waterproof bandage. She didn't react. I couldn't tell if she was unconscious or simply conserved her energy. Then I started modifying the space. I used the tarp and zip ties to create a barrier across the widest gap between pylons, reducing the tidal flow while still allowing water exchange. I anchored it with chunks of concrete rubble and tested it through a tidal cycle. It held. By mid-morning, I had created a semi-controlled pool. The water level would still rise and fall with the tide, but more slowly. The temperature would remain stable. It wasn't perfect, but it would work. I threw the first mackerel into the water around noon. It sank to the bottom of the pool. She didn't move. I sat on the broken decking and watched her for 3 hours, until hypothermia forced me to leave. When I returned that evening with dry clothes and a thermos of coffee, the mackerel was gone. She'd lifted her head above water and was watching me. Our eyes met in the fading light, and I understood that everything had changed. I had made a choice that couldn't be. Unmade. I had become the keeper of an impossible secret. I need to be precise about what I actually saw that first night, because this is where most people will decide I'm lying or insane. I've had 30 years to second-guess my own memory, to wonder if trauma or darkness or sheer impossibility twisted what was real into something I could accept. But I was a fisherman for 42 years before that night. I know the difference between a dolphin and a porpoise at 100 yards in choppy water. I can identify a species of gull by the pattern of its wing beat. I've pulled things from nets that made seasoned deckhands go quiet. My eyes were trained to see what was actually there, not what should be there. She was approximately 6 feet in length from the crown of her head to where her body tapered into what I can only describe as a caudal structure, not a fishtail, not in the way you're imagining from storybooks or movie productions. The lower half of her body was muscled and powerful, covered in skin that had a faint iridescence under my flashlight beam, colors that shifted between deep gray-green and something close to silver depending on the angle of the light. There were no scales. The texture reminded me more of dolphin skin, smooth but not slippery, with a density that suggested something built for deep pressure and cold water. Where her torso transitioned into this tail-like structure, there was no distinct separation, no clear line where human became other. It was gradual, organic, the anatomy flowing into itself in a way that looked evolutionary rather than mythological. Her upper body was unmistakably humanoid in structure, shoulders, collarbones, ribcage, all recognizable. Her arms were proportioned like a human woman's arms, perhaps slightly longer, ending in hands that had 5 distinct fingers. But the webbing between those fingers extended nearly to the first knuckle, and what I initially took for fingernails were something harder, more like the keratin sheaths on a seal's claws. Her breasts were small, functional-looking rather than aesthetic, positioned high on her chest in a way that seemed designed for streamlining. There was no navel that I could see. The face is what still comes to me in dreams. The bone structure was delicate, almost fragile-looking, high cheekbones, a narrow jaw, a small chin. Her nose was flatter than a human's, the nostrils designed to close completely, which I realized later when I watched her submerge. Her mouth was wider than it should have been, the corners extending further back than human proportions would allow, and when she grimaced in pain that first night, I saw teeth that were uniform, slightly pointed, designed for gripping rather than chewing. But her eyes, and this is the detail that I know sounds invented, sounds too perfect for a story, but I swear to you it's true. Her eyes were large and dark and entirely aware, not animal awareness, not the blank processing of a shark or the simple recognition of a dog. There was someone looking back at me. She had hair, or something very much like it, dark and matted with debris from her ordeal in the water. It grew from her scalp like human hair, but had a coarser texture, almost like seal fur, and it lay flat against her skull in a way that reduced drag. There were no ears that I could see, just small openings on either side of her head, covered by flaps of skin that I later understood could seal shut. The injury that had trapped her was severe. A section of rusted rebar from the collapsed pier section had punctured through the muscular part of her tail, maybe 8 inches from the terminal fin structure. The wound was bleeding, though the blood was darker than human blood, almost purple in the beam of my flashlight. She had managed to tear herself partially free, but the rebar had bent in the process, creating a hook that kept her pinned in maybe 4 feet of water at low tide. She could breathe. Her head was above the surface when I found her, but she couldn't swim, couldn't maneuver, couldn't escape. The tide was going out. In another 2 hours, she would have been completely exposed, dying slowly in the air. She made sounds, not speech, nothing remotely like language as I understand it, but vocalizations that had emotional content I could parse. When I first approached with the light, she produced a sound halfway between a hiss and a clicking that I understood immediately as a warning, a threat display. When I knelt down at the edge of the collapsed section, trying to assess the situation, the sound changed to something higher-pitched, almost a keening, and I recognized it as pain or distress. She was watching me with those dark eyes, her chest rising and falling rapidly, and I could see the exact moment she made some kind of calculation about whether I was a threat or a potential solution to her situation. I talked to her. I don't know why. Instinct, maybe, or the same impulse that makes you speak softly to an injured animal. I told her I wasn't going to hurt her. I told her I was going to try to help. I have no idea if she understood the words, but she understood the tone because her breathing slowed slightly and the keening sound stopped. She watched me with an intensity that was almost unbearable, and I watched her back, and in that moment I understood 2 things with absolute certainty. First, that she was intelligent. Not human intelligent necessarily, but aware in a way that created moral weight. She was experiencing this situation, processing it, making choices about how to respond. She was a person in some fundamental sense that transcended species. Second, that if anyone else discovered her, if I called the Coast Guard, if I reported this to any official body, if I told anyone at all, her life as she knew it would end. She would become a specimen, a subject, a discovery. She would be taken somewhere and studied, dissected maybe if she didn't, survive the capture, confined forever if she did. She would never return to wherever she had come from, whatever life she had lived before this night. The moment another human being saw her, she would cease to belong to herself. I made the decision in less than 3 minutes. I've had 3 decades to question it, to wonder if I was right, to consider all the things I didn't know and couldn't predict. But in that moment, kneeling in the dark beside an impossible creature who was watching me with eyes that expected nothing but more suffering, the choice felt like the only one I could make. I had a hacksaw in my toolbox. It took 40 minutes to cut through the rebar, working in near darkness because I didn't want to risk someone seeing my light from the shore. She stayed completely still while I worked, though I could see the tremors running through her body from pain and exhaustion. When the metal finally gave way and she was free, she didn't immediately bolt. She stayed there in the shallow water, watching me, and I stayed where I was, and we looked at each other for maybe 30 seconds that felt like something being decided between us. Then she slipped backward into deeper water and was gone. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my truck until dawn, staring at the dock, trying to convince myself I'd hallucinated the entire thing. But the next evening, when I returned after my shift at the cannery, she was there, back in the same spot just beyond the collapsed section. her head above water in the failing light, waiting. That was when I understood that she couldn't leave. The injury, the unfamiliar environment, something. She was trapped here as surely as she'd been trapped by that piece of rebar. And I understood that I was trapped too now by what I'd seen and what I knew and the choice I'd already made. That was the night I started building what would become her enclosure. That was the night the next 30 years began. I want to be clear about something. I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I don't believe the government is hiding alien bodies in Nevada or that pharmaceutical companies are suppressing miracle cures. I've voted in every election since I turned 18. I've paid my taxes. I've called the police when I've needed them and trusted that the systems we've built to manage society mostly work the way they're supposed to work. I'm not someone who automatically assumes authority is the enemy. But I knew, with a certainty that felt cellular, that I could not let anyone official know about her. I'd seen what happened to unusual fish catches when I was working the boats. Anything strange, anything that didn't match known species classifications, got reported to marine biology departments or fisheries management. Sometimes researchers would show up. They'd take specimens, take photographs, take tissue samples. The creature in question would end up preserved in formaldehyde or dissected on a lab table, or, if it was particularly interesting, alive in a tank somewhere being studied. Measured, cataloged, reduced to data points, that was for fish. For something like her, something that would rewrite textbooks, that would fundamentally alter our understanding of evolutionary biology and human origins, the response would be exponentially more invasive. I imagined military involvement. I imagined research facilities with armed guards. I imagined her in a tank with cameras recording every moment, scientists in protective gear taking samples of her blood and skin and tissue. I imagined them trying to communicate with her, trying to determine her intelligence level, running tests. I imagined her in captivity for the rest of her life, however long that might be, never seeing open ocean again. I couldn't do it, even if she was the last of her kind, especially if she was the last of her kind. I couldn't be the person who delivered her into that fate. The scientific value of her existence, the advancement of human knowledge, all the arguments I knew people would make about the greater good, none of it outweighed the fact that she was a thinking, feeling being who had already suffered and who deserved better than to become humanity's most prized research subject. There was another factor, though I'm less proud of this one. I was 53 years old. I'd been divorced for 8 years. My daughter lived in Oregon and called me maybe 3 times a year. I worked at the cannery, went home to an empty apartment, sometimes fished on weekends with men I'd known for decades, but couldn't honestly call friends. My life had a routine that was comfortable in the way that empty things can be comfortable. Nothing hurt, because nothing mattered very much. She gave me something that mattered. The moment I saw her, the moment I made the decision to free her from that rebar, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Purpose. The weight of a secret that massive, the responsibility for another creature's survival, the knowledge that I was the only thing standing between her and discovery. It was terrifying, but it was also electric. I was needed. My choices had consequences that extended beyond myself. For the first time since my daughter was small and still needed me for basic survival, someone's life depended on mine. I'm not saying that's noble, I'm saying it's true. Part of why I chose secrecy was to protect her. Part of why I chose secrecy was because the alternative meant returning to a life where I was barely necessary to anyone, including myself. The practical considerations came next. After the emotional decision was already made, I had to assess whether hiding her was even possible. The abandoned dock had been condemned for structural damage 3 years before I found her. The Port Authority had plans to demolish it eventually, but eventually in municipal terms meant years, maybe decades. Budget constraints, environmental assessments, competing priorities. The bureaucratic inertia that makes government slow is the same inertia that would give me time. The dock's location was ideal. It was far enough from the active port that workers had no reason to come out here. The nearest building with regular occupancy was a fish processing plant, 400 yards down the shoreline, and their operations faced the other direction. The dock was technically city property, but it was fenced off, marked with warning signs, essentially forgotten. Urban explorers came through sometimes, but they were predictable, weekends usually, and they rarely ventured into the most structurally compromised sections where the collapse had created the semi-submerged cave, where I'd found her. The tidal flow was the critical element. The collapse had created a partially enclosed pool beneath the remaining dock structure, protected from direct view by the way the broken pilings had fallen. At high tide, it filled completely with seawater. At low tide, it retained about 6 feet of depth. The opening to the main channel was narrow and choked with debris, but water flowed through constantly, meaning the environment stayed viable, stayed oxygenated, stayed saltwater rather than becoming a stagnant pool. I could work with that. I could expand it, reinforce it, turn that accidental enclosure into something more permanent. I had carpentry skills from years of boat maintenance. I knew how to work with salvaged materials, how to make things look like natural debris rather than human construction. I could build something that would keep her hidden and keep her alive. The feeding would be manageable. I still had contacts in the fishing industry. I could buy fish that didn't move through normal commercial channels, bait-grade stuff that wouldn't be missed or tracked. I could supplement with my own catches on the nights I took my small boat out. A creature her size would need maybe 20 pounds of fish every few days. Substantial, but not impossible. The risk assessment came down to this. Could I maintain the secret long enough for her to heal and leave on her own? And if she didn't leave, if she stayed, could I maintain the secret for months? Years? I didn't let myself think about decades, not then. I told myself this was temporary. I told myself I was buying her time to recover, to regain her strength, to return to wherever she'd come from. I told myself that once she was well, she would disappear back into the ocean, and my life would return to normal, and the secret would die with no harm done to anyone. I was lying to myself, but I needed those lies in the beginning. I needed to believe the commitment I was making had an end point, a moment when the weight would lift, and I could go back to being ordinary. The truth that I was signing on for something that would consume the rest of my life, that would isolate me from every normal human relationship, that would turn me into someone fundamentally unknowable to anyone I met, was too much to accept all at once. So I accepted it in pieces, one night at a time, one feeding at a time, one close call survived at a time. The first modification I made was reinforcing the opening to the enclosure with a section of fishing net weighted down with concrete blocks I stole from a construction site. From the outside, it looked like debris. From the inside, it created a barrier that would keep her contained but still allow water flow. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself it was for her own safety while she healed. I didn't let myself think about the word captivity, not yet. The second modification was a feeding platform, a partially submerged wooden shelf where I could leave fish without having to enter the water myself. I built it to look like part of the original dock structure that had broken off and settled at an angle. Anyone glancing at it would see wreckage. Only someone looking carefully would notice the newer wood, the careful construction. By the end of the first week, I had created something that could sustain her indefinitely. By the end of the first month, I had established a routine that governed my entire life. By the end of the first year, I couldn't remember what it felt like to not carry this secret. I never made a conscious decision to keep her forever. I just never made the decision to let her go. And she never tried to leave. I spent the first 3 months convinced I was watching her die. The enclosure I built wasn't elegant. It was desperation engineered into rotting wood and corroded metal, a hidden chamber carved from the dock's lowest level where the pylons met the water. I used salvaged hurricane fencing to section off a natural inlet beneath the structure, reinforced it with scrap steel I pulled from a demolished warehouse 2 miles up the coast. The entire thing measured roughly 20 feet by 15, cramped for a being that size, but the best I could manage without drawing attention. The tidal flow was the hardest part. She needed salt water, clean salt water, and the inlet trapped debris and pollution with every cycle. I spent weeks studying the dock's natural rhythms, learning where the current moved strongest during high tide, where it stagnated during low. Eventually, I constructed a crude sluice system using PVC pipe and mesh filters, the kind you'd find in industrial drainage. I replaced those filters every 4 days for 30 years. Every 4 days, without exception. Feeding her nearly broke me. That first winter, I was stealing fish from the commercial docks at 3 in the morning, whole mackerel, bluefish, sometimes squid if I could get it. I'd carry 50, 60 pounds of it in a canvas duffel, stumbling through the dark with my heart hammering every time a car passed. She needed quantity. A creature that size, I estimated she required 70 to 90 pounds of fish per week just to maintain basic health. I started night fishing that spring, learned to read the water to find where the striped bass ran thick during their migration. Some nights, I'd catch enough. Most nights, I didn't. On those nights, I'd supplement with what I could afford from the fish market, second-grade product they couldn't sell retail, stuff that was hours from turning. I told the fishmonger I was feeding rescue seals. He never questioned it. People don't question you when you show up with cash at 5:30 in the morning. The routine became everything. I'd arrive at the dock between 11 p.m. and midnight, depending on the season and the moon. I learned to move through that structure in complete darkness, every rotted board, every weak beam, every place where the metal groaned under weight. I could navigate it blind. I had to. Flashlights drew attention, and attention was the enemy. She'd be waiting in the same spot every time, floating in the deep end of the enclosure, where the water dropped to about 12 feet. I'd whistle, low, 3 short bursts, and she'd surface. Not fully, just enough that I could see the pale crown of her head, the dark spill of her hair floating around her like kelp. I'd lower the fish in a weighted net. She wouldn't take them while I was watching at first, too afraid, too uncertain. I'd have to leave, come back an hour later, to find the net empty. But over time, months, then years, she began to feed while I sat there on the walkway I'd built, along the enclosure's edge. She'd pull the fish down one by one, methodical, efficient, no frenzy, no waste. She never made sounds. That struck me harder than anything else about her. No vocalizations, no clicks or whistles like dolphins produce. Just silence and the soft movement of water against wood. I started talking to her the second year, not because I expected response, I knew better, but because the silence was crushing me. I'd tell her about my day, about the harbor master who'd nearly caught me hauling supplies at dawn, about the weather turning cold, about my brother's phone calls I never returned because how could I explain where I was every night? I told her things I'd never told anyone, the marriage that failed because I was never present, not really. The daughter who stopped calling after I missed her graduation. The slow erosion of every other relationship in my life, sacrificed at the altar of this one impossible secret. She'd watch me while I talked. Surface just enough that her eyes cleared the waterline, those eyes that tracked movement with unsettling intelligence. I couldn't read expression in them. She was too other for that. But she listened. In 30 years, she never once failed to surface when I arrived, never once turned away when I spoke. I think that's what sustained me, not duty, not moral obligation, but the fact that something in this world knew the complete truth of what I was doing, and she didn't judge it. She simply existed in the reality I'd created for her, in the small, dark world we shared beneath a dying dock. The practical challenges never stopped. Winter brought ice that threatened to seal the enclosure. I'd spend hours breaking it up with a metal pole, keeping channels clear so she could breathe. Summer brought algae blooms that choked the tidal flow. I'd wade into that water with bleach and scrub brushes, trying to keep the ecosystem viable. She was sick twice. The first time was year 7, some kind of infection that left her lethargic, barely moving for 3 weeks. I didn't know what to do. Couldn't call a veterinarian, couldn't research it without raising questions. I treated her the way I'd treat myself, kept the water as clean as possible, increased her food, added vitamin supplements crushed into the fish. She recovered. I still don't know if that was my intervention or simple luck. The second time was worse. Year 18. She stopped eating entirely for 9 days. I sat on that walkway every night, watching her float motionless in the deep water, convinced each night would be the last. On the 10th day, she took a single mackerel. On the 11th, 3 more. She survived, but she was different after that. Slower, more withdrawn. I aged alongside her. My back gave out from hauling fish and supplies. My hands developed arthritis from the constant work in cold water. I watched my hair turn gray in the dim reflection of the enclosure's surface, watched my face hollow out from decades of broken sleep and chronic stress. But I never missed a night, 30 years, and I never once failed to show up, because she had no one else, because I'd made a promise, even if I'd only made it to myself. Because somewhere in those first terrible months, caring for her had stopped being a choice and become the central organizing principle of my entire existence. I built a world for something that shouldn't exist, and in doing so, I disappeared from the world I'd known before. The change happened so gradually I didn't recognize it, until it had already consumed everything. Year 4, she started following my movements. I'd walk the length of the enclosure checking the sluice filters, and she'd parallel me underwater, her shadow keeping pace beneath the surface. Year 6, she began surfacing without the whistle. She knew my footsteps on the walkway, could distinguish them from the random creaks and groans of the settling structure. Year 9, she let me touch her. It wasn't planned. I was leaning over the edge, trying to clear a section of mesh clogged with seaweed, and she surfaced directly beside me, close enough that I could see the texture of her skin in the moonlight, filtering through the dock's broken slats, pale, almost luminous, but not scaled, something between human flesh and something slicker, more aquatic. My hand was in the water. She moved beneath it, a deliberate motion, pressing the crown of her head against my palm. I froze, stopped breathing. She held there for perhaps 3 seconds, then slipped back under and disappeared into the deep end. I sat on that walkway until dawn, trying to understand what had happened. After that, touch became part of our routine. Not every night, but often enough that I began to anticipate it. She'd surface when I arrived, and I'd rest my hand on the water's surface. Sometimes she'd ignore it. Sometimes she'd rise up just enough to make contact, head, shoulder, once the strange webbing I'd noticed between her fingers. There was nothing sexual in it, nothing romantic. It was simpler than that, and stranger. Recognition, maybe. The acknowledgement that passed between two beings who'd become the sole witnesses to each other's existence. I started bringing things to read to her. That sounds insane, written out plainly, but that's what happened. Year 11, I started reading newspaper articles aloud. Local politics, weather reports, maritime accidents. She'd surface and float there, motionless, while I narrated the small mundane disasters of the world above. Year 13, I graduated to books. Started with Moby Dick because it seemed appropriate. She'd rest with just her eyes and the top of her head above water, and I'd read by battery-powered lantern light, my voice echoing soft in that enclosed space. I have no idea if she understood language, no idea if the sounds I made carried any meaning for her beyond simple familiarity. But she listened. For hours sometimes, perfectly still, she listened. I told her everything. The marriage that ended. I described my ex-wife's face, the specific tone of her voice when she said she couldn't do this anymore, couldn't live with my absence and my secrets. I told her about my daughter's 12th birthday party that I missed because I'd been at the dock dealing with a broken sluice pipe. Told her about my father's funeral, which I left early because I knew she'd need feeding. And I couldn't explain to my brother why I had to go. She became my priest, my therapist, my witness. The repository for every regret and failure I couldn't confess to another human being. Year 17, I realized I was happier in that enclosure than anywhere else in my life. The dank smell of salt water and rotting wood, the constant anxiety of discovery, the physical exhaustion, none of it mattered compared to the relief of being completely known by another being. She never judged, never demanded explanation or justification. She simply existed in the reality I'd created, and her existence validated mine. I started documenting her behaviors in a journal. Not scientific observation, I wasn't qualified for that, but simple notes. Year 19. She started making a clicking sound with her throat when I arrive, not loud, but distinct. Year 21. Notice she's been arranging stones in the shallow end, stacking them in small cairns I have to dismantle before they interfere with the tidal flow. Year 23. She's sick again, not eating. I'm terrified. Year 24. She recovered, but she's different, less responsive. I think she's aging faster than I realized. The routines intensified as we both got older. I needed them more. The world above had become hostile and incomprehensible, everything moving too fast, everyone connected by technologies I didn't understand or trust. But the dock remained constant. Our schedule remained constant. 11 p.m. whistle, surface, feed, talk, touch, leave by 2 a.m. Every night. Every single night. My health deteriorated. Year 26, I had what I think was a minor heart attack. Didn't go to the hospital, couldn't risk the questions, the monitoring, the possibility they'd keep me overnight and break the routine. I treated it with aspirin and stubbornness, and somehow I survived. Year 28, I fell through a rotted section of walkway and dislocated my shoulder. I splinted it myself with dock wood and electrical tape, then showed up that night like always. She surfaced and stared at me for a long time, and I swear something in her posture communicated concern. I was 68 years old. She was, I didn't know, however long her kind lived. We'd been together for 28 years, longer than my marriage, longer than I'd known most people in my life. She was the most important relationship I'd ever had. I understood by then that this would end in tragedy. It had to. She was slowing down. I was slowing down. The dock itself was dying, condemned by the city, marked for demolition. I'd been ignoring the notices, but they kept coming. Year 29, they started sending inspectors. I had to time my visits perfectly, had to bribe a security guard to look the other way when I climbed the fence at midnight. The window was closing. Year 30, I made the decision. I couldn't let them find her during demolition, couldn't let her end as a specimen in some government facility, poked and studied and displayed. She'd lived in hiding for 3 decades. She deserved to die in hiding if it came to that. But I was 70 years old with a failing heart and hands that barely worked anymore. I couldn't move her myself, couldn't release her into open water. She'd been captive too long, wouldn't survive. So I did the only thing left. I told someone. The first decade felt like a held breath. Every footstep on the dock above sent my pulse racing. Every unfamiliar engine sound out on the water made me freeze mid-motion, fish bucket in hand, waiting to see if this would be the moment it all ended. I was 43 when I found her. By the time I turned 53, the hypervigilance had carved permanent lines into my face that had nothing to do with age. But somewhere in those middle years, call it year 12, maybe 13, the acute panic dulled into something else, not complacency. I was never careless. But the fear transformed into a different kind of awareness. I stopped jumping at every sound and started cataloging them instead. I learned to distinguish the hollow thud of a beer can kicked by a drunk from the deliberate footfall of someone actually exploring. I could hear the difference between wind moving through rotted planking and human weight testing the structure's integrity. The routine became muscle memory. I didn't have to think about the Tuesday and Friday night visits anymore. My body simply knew when to wake, when to move, what to carry. I kept the same dented cooler for 18 years, the same fillet knife. I wore the handles smooth on both. She changed too. The injuries from that first night healed within the first year, but other changes came slower. Her coloring shifted with the seasons in ways I didn't expect. Darker in winter months, almost translucent in summer when the water warmed, and more light filtered down through the gaps in the dock above. By year 15, I noticed the first signs of aging, a slight dulling of the scales along her lower back, the webbing between her fingers growing slightly, less taut. She moved a little slower in cold water. I aged faster. My knees went bad around year 20. The climb down the iron ladder became genuinely difficult, especially in winter when my joints seized up. I had to start bringing a headlamp because my night vision wasn't what it had been. I developed a chronic cough from 3 decades of breathing the damp air in that enclosed space, salt and rot and something organic I could never quite name. We had no language, but we had something. I would sit on the concrete ledge, and she would surface near my feet, close enough that I could see the small movements of her gills. Sometimes she would rest her hand, I called it a hand, though it wasn't quite that, on the edge beside mine, not touching, just near. I think she understood that I was aging in ways she wasn't. The isolation calcified around me like coral. I stopped accepting dinner invitations around year 8, stopped returning calls by year 10. My sister gave up trying to visit after I turned her away at the door 3 times in the same month. People assumed I'd become one of those bitter coastal hermits you see sometimes, drunk and alone and angry at nothing in particular. I let them think it. It was easier than the truth. I had one close friend through most of it, a guy named Tim who ran the bait shop and never asked questions about why I bought so much fish. He died in year 24, heart attack behind the counter on a Tuesday morning. I found out 3 days later when I showed up and saw the closed sign still hanging in the window. I didn't go to the funeral. I couldn't explain to anyone there how much that loss actually meant or why. The near misses accumulated like scars. Year 9, a pair of urban explorers with cameras and climbing gear. I watched from a distance as they spent 2 hours photographing the upper levels of the dock coming within 20 feet of the access ladder. They never looked down. Year 16, a survey crew from the Port Authority doing structural assessments. They took measurements, drove test pilings, collected water samples from the channel. One of them commented that the old dock was surprisingly stable given its age. I'd reinforced key supports myself over the years. They were measuring my work without knowing it. Year 22 brought the worst scare, a winter storm with sustained winds over 60 miles per hour. I couldn't get to her for 3 nights. The weather made it impossible to reach the dock safely. When I finally made it down the ladder, I found part of the enclosure's wire mesh torn away, and she was gone from the main pool. I spent 20 minutes in absolute terror, sweeping my flashlight across the water before I found her wedged into a narrow gap between 2 support pilings. She'd hidden herself. Survived. But the mesh took me 4 visits to fully repair, and during that time, I barely slept. The teenagers came in year 27, 3 of them around midnight on a Saturday, drunk and loud and daring each other to explore the haunted dock. I was there when they arrived. I'd come early that night, some instinct I'd learned to trust, telling me to check the site before my usual schedule. I heard them coming from 100 yards away, laughing, breaking glass, the reckless noise of people who think they're alone. I had maybe 90 seconds before they'd be directly overhead. I killed my headlamp and didn't move. She sensed the tension and sank deeper, only her eyes above the waterline. The 3 kids spent 15 minutes on the dock. One of them leaned against the railing directly above where I sat in darkness, not breathing. He had a phone out, taking selfies. The flash lit up the spaces between the planks. If he'd pointed that camera down instead of at his own face, he would have seen me. They left. She surfaced slowly. I waited another hour before turning my light back on. By year 28, I'd developed a collection of close calls. That played on loop in my head during the hours I couldn't sleep. Each one had reinforced the same lesson. The secret was always one moment, one wrong angle, one piece of bad luck away from total exposure. But the nature of the threat was changing. The teenagers with their phones were different from the urban explorers with their cameras, and those were different from the survey crews with their equipment. Each represented a different kind of danger: drunken accident, deliberate investigation, institutional scrutiny. I'd learned to navigate all three, but I could feel the margin for error shrinking. The Urbex community worried me most. I started monitoring their forums online around year 25, after I finally broke down and bought a cheap laptop. They had whole threads dedicated to abandoned waterfronts, complete with GPS coordinates and detailed entry strategies. Someone had posted photos of my dock in year 26. The images showed the upper structure, the collapsed sections, the rusted warning signs. The comments were full of people planning visits. I made it harder for them, not impossible. That would draw attention, but harder. I removed a section of the safest access ladder, destabilized a walkway that looked solid but wasn't, spread rumors in town about police patrols targeting trespassers. Most Urbex explorers are looking for good shots, not genuine danger. Make it slightly riskier than the next location, and they'll move on. But I couldn't control everything. Year 29 brought drones. I first noticed them in late spring, small quadcopters buzzing over the waterfront like mechanical insects. Hobbyists, mostly. People filming the sunset or getting aerial shots of the harbor. I watched them from my kitchen window with a growing sense of dread. The technology was getting cheaper, more common, and it eliminated the need to physically access the dock at all. One Sunday morning, I watched a drone hover directly over the structure for nearly 10 minutes. The operator, a kid with a controller standing on the public beach, was clearly filming. I couldn't tell what he was capturing. The drone's camera was pointed down. From that angle, could he see through the gaps in the planking? Could he see the ladder, the enclosure below? I didn't sleep that night. I spent the next week searching online for any new videos of the waterfront. I found the footage on a YouTube channel with 43 subscribers. The title was Abandoned Dock Aerial View 4K, 7 minutes of slow pans and orbital shots. At the 4-minute mark, the drone descended low over the water near the pilings. The camera swept across the substructure. I watched that 4-second span of footage 20 times. You could see the iron ladder. You could see something beneath the surface that might have been the edge of the wire mesh, though it could also have been shadows or debris. The video had 18 views, no comments. I reported it for violating drone regulations over water. YouTube took it down within a week. But the fact that it existed at all told me everything I needed to know. I couldn't hide from the sky anymore. The city surveyors returned in year 30. This time, they weren't just taking measurements. They were marking demolition zones. I'm 71 years old now. My hands shake when I climb down to the water. The ladder rungs are slick with algae, and twice last month I've nearly fallen. I catch myself, grip tighter, continue down into the dark. But I know what's coming. I've known for 3 years. The city approved the waterfront development project in 2019. I saw the notice posted on the chain-link fence surrounding the dock property. Luxury condominiums. Marina slips for pleasure boats. A boardwalk with restaurants and shops. The abandoned industrial dock, my dock, sat directly in the path of progress. The demolition timeline gave 18 months. Then the pandemic delayed everything. I had more time, but time was running out in other ways too. My doctor found the tumor in 2020. Stage 3. They removed what they could, started me on treatment. I lost weight I couldn't afford to lose. The nausea made the smell of fish unbearable for months, but I fed her anyway, forcing myself through the dry heaves. She noticed the change in me. I could see it in how she watched me during those visits, her head tilted slightly, eyes tracking my movements with something that looked like concern. But it wasn't just my failing body or the city's development plans. The world itself had changed in ways that made hiding anything nearly impossible. The drones started appearing around 2018, hobbyists at first, flying their expensive toys along the waterfront at sunset, capturing aerial footage of the harbor. I'd hear the mosquito whine of their motors and freeze, watching from the dock's entrance as they drifted overhead. They never stayed long. The dock wasn't scenic, just rotting timber and stained concrete. But each time one appeared, I felt the walls closing in. Then came the urban explorers. They'd always existed, the trespassers and adventure seekers, but social media had turned abandoned places into content. I found evidence of them in the summer of 2019. Fresh footprints in the dust, cigarette butts that weren't mine, spray-painted tags on the walls that hadn't been there the week before. One morning I discovered a tripod set up near the water's edge, left behind or forgotten. I threw it in the harbor. I started checking the platforms, YouTube, Instagram, TikTok. I searched for the dock's location, the neighborhood name, anything that might show me what was being posted. I found videos, not many, but enough. Teenagers filming themselves climbing through the broken windows. A young woman doing a photo series on industrial decay. None of them had found the enclosure. None had gone deep enough into the substructure or visited at the right tide level or stayed after dark. But they'd been close. The surveillance was getting tighter too. The city installed security cameras on the nearby commercial pier in 2020. Their range didn't quite reach the abandoned dock, but I had to change my route, approaching from the north side now through a gap in the fence that I prayed no one else knew about. I considered ending it. Not my life. Hers. The thought came to me one night as I sat on the platform watching her sleep, her breathing slow and steady in the shallow water. I could open the gate to the harbor, let her return to the ocean. She was healed now, strong enough to survive. 30 years was long enough. But I didn't know if she could survive out there anymore. She'd spent her entire adult life, if that term even applied, in this enclosure. The harbor had changed too. The water was warmer now, more acidic. Shipping traffic had increased. I'd read about the sonar systems on modern vessels, the noise pollution in coastal waters. I'd protected her from human discovery, but I didn't know if I'd prepared her for the world beyond these walls. And there was the other question, the one I couldn't answer. Did she want to leave? She'd never tried to escape. In the early years, I'd worried she might, kept the gate mechanism locked, even though she probably could have forced it. But she'd stayed. When I arrived each night, she surfaced to meet me. When I sat at the water's edge, she came close. I didn't know if this was contentment or learned helplessness or something else entirely. I didn't speak her language. I never had. The final pressure came from my daughter. She'd been calling more frequently since my diagnosis, worried about me living alone, insisting I move closer to her family in Portland. The conversations were getting harder to deflect. She'd started talking about putting the house on the market, about assisted living facilities, about not being able to take care of myself much longer. She was right, of course. I was forgetting. Things. Small things at first, where I'd put my keys, whether I'd taken my medication. But then larger gaps appeared. I'd lose track of days. I missed 2 feeding visits in the winter of 2021, something that had never happened before. Both times I'd simply forgotten. The routine that had structured my entire adult life suddenly erased from memory for 48 hours. She'd survived both lapses, but I saw the warning clearly. My mind was failing the same way my body was. The secret I'd kept for 3 decades was living inside a deteriorating vessel. I made a decision in March 2022. I started documenting everything. I wrote down the location, the access route, the feeding schedule. I described her appearance, her behaviors, everything I could remember from 30 years of observation. I didn't know who I was writing it for, maybe no one, maybe everyone. But I needed it to exist outside my failing memory. The demolition notice arrived in August, final this time. The crews would begin work in October. I had 2 months. I sat in the enclosure for hours that night, not speaking, just watching her move through the water. She was older now, too. I could see gray in the hair that flowed behind her when she swam. Her movements were slower, more deliberate. We'd grown old together, she and I, locked in this strange symbiosis that the world would never understand. I needed to make a choice. Release her and hope she survived. Stay silent and let the demolition crews discover her, turning her into a spectacle and me into a criminal. Or find someone to trust, to pass the burden to, knowing that sharing the secret meant losing control of it forever. The walls had been closing in for years. Now they were about to crush everything I'd protected. The video went live on September 14, 2022, at 6:47 p.m. I know because I watched the view count climb in real time. Once my daughter called me, her voice tight with confusion, and something else, fear maybe, or anger. She'd sent me the link. A 22-year-old urban exploration YouTuber named Derek Chen had posted drone footage titled, "Abandoned Dock. Is that a person in the water?" I didn't want to watch it. I sat at my kitchen table with the phone in my shaking hand and knew that watching it would make it real. But it was already real. The count was at 43,000 views when I finally pressed play. The footage was shot at dusk, golden hour. The harbor turned amber and purple in the fading light. The drone swept over the waterfront, climbing higher to show the skyline, then descended toward the dock. I recognized the angle immediately, approaching from the south, over the water, exactly where the security cameras couldn't see. The drone entered through one of the high broken windows. I could hear Derek's voice on the commentary, excited, narrating his exploration. The camera moved through the interior, past the rusted machinery I'd walked past 10,000 times. Then it descended, toward the lower level. I wanted to stop the video, close the browser, pretend I hadn't seen it. But I watched as the drone dropped through the gap in the floor, its LED lights cutting through the darkness, illuminating the water below. The enclosure was visible for 8 seconds. The drone hovered, Derek's narration stopping mid-sentence. The camera was too far away for detail, but the shape was clear, something pale, moving through the dark water, something that surfaced briefly, a face turned upward toward the light, eyes reflecting the LED glow, and then gone, vanished beneath the surface so quickly it almost looked like a trick of the water. "Did you see that?" Derek's voice on the video. "What was that? Rewind, did you see that?" The footage replayed in slow motion, the pale shape breaking the surface, the suggestion of features that weren't quite right. Then, darkness again. The video ended with Derek promising to return, to investigate further, to find out what's really down there. The view count was at 68,000 when I closed the browser. My daughter was asking me questions I couldn't answer. Did I know anything about this? Had I seen anything strange at the old dock? People were already commenting that it looked like a person, that someone might be living in there, that the police should be called. She wanted to know if I was safe, if I should stay somewhere else tonight. I told her I was fine. Told her it was probably just a seal or a trick of the light. Told her I'd call her tomorrow. Then I sat in the kitchen as the sun finished setting and tried to decide what to do. I drove to the dock at midnight. I parked 3 blocks away and walked the approach route I'd used for 30 years, moving slowly now, my breath short, my legs uncertain. The fence gap was still there. The dock was dark and silent. I found evidence of Derek's return visit immediately. Fresh tire tracks in the dirt outside, a discarded energy drink can near the entrance. He'd been back, probably that same night, probably with better equipment. I climbed down to the enclosure. She was waiting near the platform, her eyes finding me in the dark. I sat at the water's edge, and she came close, closer than usual, her webbed hand reaching up to touch my knee briefly before withdrawing. I tried to explain. The words came out broken, inadequate. I told her things were going to change, that people knew now, or suspected, or would soon discover the truth, that I was sorry, that I'd tried to protect her, but I'd failed. She watched me while I spoke. I don't know what she understood. I'd spent 3 decades with her, and I still didn't know how much of human language she comprehended, how much was tone and gesture and routine rather than meaning. But she watched, and she stayed close. And when I finally stopped talking, she made the sound, the one I'd only heard a handful of times in 30 years, the clicking musical vocalization that might have been her species' equivalent of speech, or might have been something else entirely. I stayed until dawn. I fed her the fish I'd brought, watched her eat, memorized the way she moved through the water, because I knew I might not see it many more times. The authorities arrived 3 days later, not because of the video. It had been dismissed by most viewers as clever CGI or misidentified wildlife, but because Derek had filed a formal report with the police claiming there might be a homeless person living in the abandoned dock, potentially in danger. 2 officers came first. I wasn't there, but I found their report later. They'd entered the building, found nothing suspicious on the main level, and left. The enclosure was invisible unless you knew where to look, and they hadn't looked carefully enough. Derek went back again, his second video posted on September 20th. This time, he'd brought underwater lights and a better camera. The footage showed the enclosure clearly, the modified grating, the pool separated from the harbor, the platform I'd built. And it showed her briefly diving away from the light, but clearly visible for almost 3 seconds. The shape of her, the movement that was wrong for any known marine mammal, the pale limbs that bent in ways that suggested something other than human, but disturbingly close. That video reached 500,000 views in 12 hours. The media arrived the next morning. Local news first, then regional stations, then the networks. The Coast Guard sent an inspection team. The city deployed their emergency services division. By noon on September 21st, the abandoned dock was surrounded by vehicles, camera crews, and officials trying to establish a perimeter around a building that had been forgotten for decades. I arrived at 2 p.m. I'd made my decision during the long night before. I couldn't hide anymore. I couldn't protect her through secrecy because the secret was gone. So I would protect her the only way I had left, by controlling the narrative, by speaking first, by making them see her as I'd seen her, not as a specimen or a discovery or proof of anything, but as a living being who'd survived in the shadows of human civilization for longer than most of the people now gathered outside could imagine. I walked through the crowd of reporters to the police barricade. I told the officer my name and said I had information about what was inside the building. They brought me to the incident commander, a Coast Guard captain named Morrison. I sat in the back of a command vehicle and told him everything, where the enclosure was, how long she'd been there, what I'd done to keep her alive. He didn't believe me at first. I could see it in his face. But I kept talking, describing details no one could have invented. The precise location of the hidden entrance, the tide schedule I'd followed for 3 decades, the modification to the harbor gate that allowed water circulation while preventing her escape. "You're saying you've kept a mermaid hidden in there for 30 years, Morrison said finally. "I'm saying I found an injured living being in 1992 and made a choice," I answered. "What you call her is your decision." They sent in a dive team at 4 p.m. I watched from behind the barricade as they entered the building in full gear, cameras mounted on their helmets. The footage streaming to monitors in the command vehicle. I saw her one last time on those monitors. She didn't flee from the divers. She surfaced in the center of the pool and watched them, her head above water, her eyes catching the light from their equipment. The lead diver stopped moving. I could hear his breathing through the radio link, fast and shallow, then a long pause, then a single word. Confirmed. The moment the secret broke, everything changed in the way I'd feared it would for 30 years. They came in waves, first the police, then the Coast Guard, then agencies whose acronyms I didn't recognize and whose authority I couldn't question. Men in suits with credentials and search warrants, scientists with equipment cases, military personnel who didn't introduce themselves at all. I stopped being the keeper. I became a subject of interest, questioned, examined, suspected of hoax or worse. Marina stopped being a living thing. She became a specimen, a security concern, an asset to be secured and studied. They cordoned off the entire dock within hours. Yellow tape and armed guards where there had been nothing but shadows and silence for 3 decades. Helicopters circled overhead. News vans lined the waterfront road, their satellite dishes pointed skyward, broadcasting the impossible to a world that would consume it as spectacle. I wasn't allowed near the enclosure. They escorted me away, while men in wetsuits entered the water I'd swum in 10,000 times, carrying nets and tranquilizer equipment designed for large marine mammals. I heard her cry once, a sound I'd never heard before, sharp with terror. And then nothing. They took me to a facility I can't name and asked questions I couldn't answer in ways that satisfied them. What was she? Where had she come from? Were there others? Had I contacted anyone? Had anyone else known? The same questions, different voices, for days. The tragedy wasn't the discovery itself. It was what discovery meant, that the world I'd protected her from had finally broken through, and everything I'd feared was unfolding exactly as I'd known it would. The story spread online within 48 hours of the initial reports. Grainy footage from the news helicopters, leaked photos from inside the cordon, eyewitness accounts from dock workers and waterfront residents who claimed they'd heard things, seen things over the years, but never spoken up. Within a week, it had metastasized into folklore. Forums dissected every detail. Reddit threads reached tens of thousands of comments. Conspiracy communities wove it into larger narratives about government cover-ups and hidden species. Skeptics denounced it as elaborate fiction. Believers held it up as vindication. The official word came quietly. No comment from any agency involved. The dock was demolished on schedule. The man, me or whoever the keeper truly was, disappeared from public record. No charges filed, no further statements. The story became something the authorities refused to confirm or deny, which only fed its growth. What's true? That's the question everyone asks, and the one I can't definitively answer for you. The account exists. The details are consistent across retellings. The location is real. You can find the waterfront, see where the dock once stood, though there's nothing there now, but new construction. But the mermaid herself? Whether she existed as described, whether any of this happened as claimed, or whether it's a modern legend born from our deep need to believe the world still holds mysteries, that's something. Each person decides for themselves. What I know is this: the story endures because it touches something true about the human relationship with the unknown. We want to believe in hidden things. We want to believe one person could protect the impossible from a world that would destroy it through examination. The truth may be that such protection was always temporary. His story exists in isolation, one man, one creature, one abandoned dock. But the questions it raises have echoed through human history for as long as we've stared into deep water and wondered what stared back. We've been documenting impossible things in the ocean for centuries. In 1493, Christopher Columbus reported 3 mermaids rising from the waters off Haiti, though he noted they were not as beautiful as legend suggested. In 1608, Henry Hudson's crew recorded a mermaid sighting in the Arctic Sea, describing her pale skin and dark hair in the ship's official log. Japanese fishermen have passed down accounts of ningyo for generations, fish-like humanoids with human faces and voices like larks. The Orkney Islands kept records of selkies. Polynesian cultures documented RI. The pattern spans continents and centuries. Something humanoid, something that shouldn't exist, something glimpsed at the boundary between our world and the depths. Modern documentation hasn't ended these reports. It's formalized them. Naval personnel have filed official incident reports describing unidentified submerged objects moving at impossible speeds, exhibiting technological capabilities beyond our understanding. The USS Nimitz Tic Tac encounter made headlines, but dozens of similar incidents remain classified or dismissed. We've mapped the surface of Mars in higher resolution than we've mapped our own ocean floor. 95% of the ocean remains unexplored. We genuinely do not know what lives in the abyssal zones, the Hadal trenches, the unmapped territories of the deep. If the old man's story is true, if he really did hide something impossible for 30 years, he wouldn't be the first to face that choice between protection and revelation. We'll likely never know what happened in that abandoned dock, whether the creature existed, whether she survived the exposure, whether the old man told the truth or crafted the most elaborate fiction of the digital age. But the question he claimed to have faced remains real. If you found something impossible, something that could rewrite our understanding of the world, would you protect it from the chaos of revelation, or would you expose it to the light, consequences be damned? The ocean keeps its secrets, and perhaps some secrets are meant to stay hidden in the deep.